Hi, Misha here, and over on the main Mishaco channel, did a gun and model video where I looked at 3 or 4 guns from the Swiss Luftwaffe, the Swiss Air Force, and 4 aircraft. But that was kind of a general overview, not to make it too long. And I told people over there, if they came over here to the private channel, the personal channel, just Misha, I would have a more in-depth video focusing on the airplanes. So if you came from Mishaco, welcome. And if you're one of the few people that view this channel and not the main one, you might want to go over and check that out as well. So yeah, with that, let's look at the modern jet fighters that have been used in recent history or are still used today by the Swiss Luftwaffe, Swiss Air Force. Over here we have a model of a Hawker Hunter. This is an FGA 9, which is the ground attack variant. This is from Corgi, by the way, 1/72 scale diecast. Next we have a French Mirage III. Another 1/72 scale diecast. This one is an old Falcon model. Both of these are retired from the Swiss Air Force today, but actually saw service well into the 1990s. Moving on, we have a Hobby Master 1/72 scale diecast. This is of a Swiss F-5 Tiger II. And these are actually still in limited use as we roll into 2021. And then finally, we have the premier frontline fighter, the FA-18 Hornet. This is the 18C variant, again from Hobby Master. This is a current 2019-2020 style in the air defense role. And these entered into service in the 90s and are still very much the premier aircraft today, and probably will remain so for at least another decade. So with that, well, let's just get into it. And really, you can't talk Swiss Air Force and not talk about the Hunter, because it was very influential. The British Hawker Hunter, and the one on the spinny thing right now is the F6, or the Fighter Mark VI. And this was kind of the first fully developed version. The F4 had some issues and so on and so forth. And it was designed as a fighter interceptor, originally relying on 4 30mm cannon with a total of 600 rounds. So this would go into service in the UK starting in 1954. In Switzerland, they had been using the older de Havilland Vampire, as well as the slightly newer de Havilland Venom. But these were very much 1940s first generation and second generation jets. So around 56, 57, the Swiss Luftwaffe started looking at what to go and purchase or build or whatever for their next jet fighter. Now, they did have a domestic design being worked on at the Federal Aircraft Factory in Emmen, known as the P-16. So that was what some were advocating. Let's domestically design an aircraft. Foreign designs they were interested in, though, included the North American F-86F Sabre, advanced version of the Sabre, and also the, at that time, quite new, fallen Gnat. Most people know the Gnat as a trainer, but there was a fighter version known as the F-1. And the other aircraft they were looking at was the Hunter here, which was pretty early on a favorite in 1957. And they would acquire 2 examples from the UK as loaners for testing, And they obviously liked what they saw, because in January of 1958, they placed an initial order with Hawker for 100. And the Swiss version would be known as the Mark 58. And it was very, very similar to the F6 you see here, but with a few updates and changes. For example, it had a new radio communication set, which makes sense because different country. And it also had the outer wing hardpoints pylons cleared to carry iron bombs. On this model here, this is another Corgi. They have tanks on them. The first model you saw in the intro, they're on the inner points. But with the Swiss version, all 4 points were cleared to carry iron bombs. And they had a few structural updates and strengthening process. But basically, it was a British F6. The first 12 they received beginning in April of 1958 were reworked XRAF F6. They were updated to the Mark 58 standard. The following 88, though, were brand new off the production line, with the last of those being received in April of 1960. So we have 100 in Swiss service, and they would be used in the air defense role as an interceptor. But by 1960, guns were not exactly great. So, starting in 1963, the Swiss Hunter was cleared to carry 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders, one on each outer pylon outboard station. They also were cleared to carry a number of iron bombs, as well as various rockets, and even some napalm canisters, because it was thought this could have a secondary ground attack role in case, the Russians decided to pay them a visit. They would have something to either pin their troops down with or support Swiss troops. So this was their frontline modern jet fighter, and it was certainly an improvement over the older de Havillands. It was about 45 feet long, with a wingspan of about 33 feet. So not huge, but not small. It could carry about 7,000 pounds on the 4-wing hardpoints. And it had a maximum speed of about 700 miles per hour at lower altitudes, but this would fall off to 650, even 625 at high altitudes. So the Hunter was more of a low and medium altitude performer. It did have a max altitude of 50,000 feet, but really past about 35,000 feet, speed dropped off precipitously. That was just kind of a consequence of its engine. So it did well in the low roll, especially with the newer AIM-9 Sidewinders, and was even adopted by the Patrouille Suisse, the demonstration team, beginning in 1964 when they were formed. They put smoke generators on these and what have you. So yeah, this is a Corgi of a British F6, kind of an earlier production one, which would make sense for showing off one of the Swiss ones. But by the late 60s, the Mirage, which we'll get into in just a minute, started taking over as the air defender. But they were far from done with the Hunter. This Corgi model is of an RAF FGA-9, a Hunter Fighter Ground Attack Mark 9. And in Britain, after the Hunter kind of had fulfilled and was no longer useful in air-to-air, they reworked theirs for ground attack. And Switzerland, much with the same path. Mirage would go into service, but there were many scandals and there never were enough, so the Hunter did have to soldier on as a secondary air defense into the 1970s, but efforts were already underway to acquire something else. Between 70 and 74, though, the Swiss would pick up another 60 ex-RAF refurbished examples. Of these, actually 8 would be the two-seat trainer. The variant made for Switzerland was called the T-68. And the rest would actually be pretty much the FGA-9 here, known as the Mark 58A. So they were further enhanced for ground attack roles, strengthened pylons for carriage of more things. And so, once they acquired these, they had a pretty good fleet, and they started transitioning Hunters over to ground attack in 1973, 74, 75, allowing them to finally retire the last of the de Havilland Venoms. And then they would have the Hunter 80 program, which would further update their fleet. They would add chaff and flare dispensers, and they would further increase the carriage ability of these. They would be able to operate the new, at the time, AIM-65 Maverick air-to-surface guided missile, as well as various new rockets, including 80mm, as well as just midlife frame extensions. And so, yeah, the 70s and 80s, the Swiss fleet was ready for close air support ground attack, which really freed things up throughout the entire Air Force, the Luftwaffe. So we had two basic versions, the Mark 58 and the Mark 58A. And the Swiss versions were pretty advanced. Again, AIM-9 Sidewinders, Maverick missiles, 80mm rocket pods, plus the ability to use napalm. They were pretty tried and tested. And as of 1990, they still had 130 in service. And they probably would have stayed in even longer, except a year later, right at the same time the Soviet Union was collapsing, they found some stress fractures in the wings, meaning that older high-hour airplanes had to be retired. And then there would be a push beginning in 93 to kind of change the role of the Air Force to get away from any kind of ground attack or close support of the troops. So several factors combined to show the retirement of the Swiss Hunter in 1994, which was earlier than it originally had been anticipated. But many of the airframes still had life left in them, and several ex-Swiss Air Force Hunters can be found even today, used for demos or private aggressor teams or what have you. They're still around. It was a very effective aircraft in Switzerland, and sturdy. As John Lake said, if the Hunter had not existed, the Swiss would have invented it, because they definitely used them extensively, and it was well suited to their mountainous terrain, where beyond visual range was not really likely because of all the mountains, and its maneuverability really worked well for them. Ease of maintenance and the fact that it had relatively limited fuel and short range really were not factors for that nation. But the fact that it was subsonic or transonic at best, and was not designed for missiles, much less newer radar sets, meant that, by the 1960s and 70s, this really was just good for ground attack. To that end, they would need a brand new generation to work as fighter interceptors. The French Dassault Mirage III. The first two models we looked at were 1/72 scale from Corgi and they are the gear up and down ones, even though they're older. Well, this is from Falcon, who used to make models, but does not anymore because they didn't always bother to get the license from the company to do so, which is actually why they quit making Mirages. The French company Dassault is known for kind of protecting their designs, even in diecast. Anyway, 1960, the Hawker Hunter is in full force, but supersonic is very much the norm now, and even Mach 2 is starting to look possible. And the Mirage was a very advanced aircraft. It first flew at the end of 1956 in testing and entered into French Air Force service in 1961. That year, the Swiss Parliament looked at a few designs. The two main contenders were the Swedish Saab 35 Draken and the French Dassault Mirage III. And they voted and decided to build under license 100 Mirage 3S variants in Switzerland. In addition to that, they voted to purchase 67 Bristol Bloodhound missile sets from the UK. Here's a Bristol Bloodhound missile. This is a mobile surface-to-air defense missile, which was actually quite modern for its day and time, believe it or not. And this model is actually from Oxford. Pretty neat. Comes with the full set. So that was kind of their idea. They would have those surface-to-air missiles, and they would have the new Mirage, which was very advanced for the day and time, and for a time the fastest aircraft around. It was over 49 feet long, but it only had a wingspan of 27 feet. This meant it was actually quite easy to operate in and out of the caves that the Swiss Air Force used. Had a max speed of Mach 2.2 and had a maximum altitude of 56,000 feet or greater. It had two 30mm Defa cannons, each with 125 rounds, so less than the Hunter, but its primary defense and offense were its missiles. It had 5 hardpoints and could carry either AIM-9 Sidewinders or Magic missiles on the wings, so short range, or a medium range missile on the center line. It could also carry fuel tanks that doubled as rocket dispensers on the wings. But the Swiss, they wanted some changes. Now, they did in 1961 purchase one Mirage III, delivered from France. This was for testing and evaluation. But for their version, the 3S, they wanted an American fire control system by Hughes so they could use the AIM-4 Falcon missile. They also wanted everything to be strengthened, the wings, the fuselage, the landing gear. This is so it could be operated from their short airfields using even rocket-assisted takeoff if necessary. And it was modified where it could be easily lifted, hoisted by a crane, which is another reason it was reinforced, so they could move them around inside the caverns. And a few other changes besides to make it compatible with the Swiss Air Force system. And the idea, after the one purchase from France, these would be assembled, built by the Federal Aircraft Factory at Emmen, and they hoped to be able to get one airframe to do 3 roles, primarily an interceptor, secondary as a ground attacker, and tertiary as a reconnaissance craft. The idea, they thought they could just take the same airframe and put on reconnaissance pods on the wings and take pictures with those. Well, during testing, they quickly realized that wasn't going to work. They really destroyed the maneuverability and the speed, so they ended up having to create the Mirage III RS, which was a dedicated reconnaissance variant. Instead of the radar in the nose, this variant had cameras. It also could carry a reconnaissance pod on the center line. But either way, yeah, they had to have two variants now, which complicates things. And in addition to that, they were just major cost overruns. In fact, the program ended up costing near double the estimation. And this actually led to the first parliamentary fact-finding commission in Swiss history. And it led to more than not a huge number, but 3 or 4 resignations, including the current head of the Swiss Luftwaffe, Swiss Air Force, and kind of a restructuring and more oversight given, because these were purchased with very little testing, very little oversight, very little specification delivered. So it's kind of a wonder they even went into service. The first ones the Swiss Air Force received were in 1964. They were French-built Mirage III-B 2-seat trainers. They would get 2 of those. In 1967, the first Swiss-built example would enter into service as an interceptor. And then in 1969, the first reconnaissance-built version would enter into service. Again, Swiss-built. They originally wanted 100. Well, after all the budgetary overruns, there was only money for 36 interceptors and 18 reconnaissance variants, which meant they were not able to even come close to fulfilling the role they were intended for. They had 2 squadrons of interceptors from this and only 1 of a reconnaissance. And again, they had 2 2-seat trainers. Nevertheless, they were put into service, and they did well, honestly, even though there was a lot of scandal, and it kind of tarnished the whole name going forward. They never really had enough. That's why the Hawker Hunter had to kind of hang on, at least as a second line air defense craft, for a number of years. Now this Falcon here, it's one good thing you can say about the Falcon models, they're very heavy die-cast. They don't have the detail of later things like Corgi or Hobby Master, but they do have gear up or down, opening canopy, and they were very cheap back in the day. But even though production was over by the 1980s, there was an effort to improve and to give a midlife update to the existing Swiss Mirage fleet. Meet the Israeli Aircraft Industries, the IAI Kfir C2. Israel also used the Mirage III, but through various political things, they ended up making an unlicensed copy with the American J79 engine. That would ultimately become the Kfir here. Well, when Switzerland was looking to update and upgrade their Mirages, also giving them more ground attack abilities, so they can retire the Hunters, they turned to IAI. And between 1985 and 1988, a majority of the fleet was updated. They would add these new small canards on the engines here. Those were done to give a little better low-speed maneuverability for takeoff and landing, or for flying through the valleys of Switzerland. They would also give more of a dogtooth edge to the wing. They would add new countermeasures for self-defense, and they would give updated avionics, electronics, all of which were Israeli in origin. So is it any wonder, even though this is an Israeli model here, again from Falcon. The Swiss updated version was known as the Mirage III S C.70, and the ground attack version in Israel was known as the C.7. So, yeah, pretty close. Now, this model here is actually of an F-21 used by the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps as aggressor training. So, the U.S. Navy actually flew some of these Israeli aircraft for a while. It's kind of interesting what would end up replacing them, we'll get to. But, yeah, it was a joint project in a lot of ways between FAF and IAF to update the existing fleet and extend their service life, which they did. Also to help them get into more of maybe a ground attack role. By this point, the Swiss planes would no longer be using the very outdated AIM-4 Falcon. They had long since switched over to the AIM-9 Sidewinder, typically carrying 2, but they could carry 4 in a pinch. Going into the 90s, they're very much in service, but starting to get old. Therefore, in 1999, the Mirage 3Ss, or Mirage 3S C-70s to be exact, were retired. The reconnaissance variant would soldier on for a bit longer, with the last of those retired in 2003. And with that, kind of a rocky chapter in Swiss aviation history would also come to a close. The Northrop F-5 Tiger II. At first, this might seem an odd choice for Switzerland, but actually it fit very well. And it was also them making sure they did not make the same mistake twice. The Mirage was too expensive, and really, because of the small size of their country, they didn't need its extreme speed and altitude and all that. And of course, they realized they needed much more oversight and planning. So, as they continued to expand the role of the Luftwaffe in the 1970s, focusing more on reconnaissance and ground attack, and since they did not have enough Mirages, and they needed to retire the existing Venoms, which were used for ground attack, letting the Hawkers switch over, a new program was held. Again, the idea was floated about a domestic design, but this was pretty quickly decided against by 1972-73, and this would be the last time that a domestic Swiss plane was talked about. From this point on, they're just going to stick with foreign designs, customizing them to their needs. As I said, they did acquire 52 single-seat and 8 twin-seat Hunters in the 70s to kind of fill a stopgap. But then they started looking at various aircraft around the world in 1973-1974. They did consider the Hawker Siddeley Harrier, which, might make sense for their needs, but it was not a very great air defense fighter, more geared towards ground attack, and that's not what they're needing, so it got ruled out. Somewhat similar, the A4 Skyhawk was briefly considered, but didn't really get much past anywhere. Now, by 74, they were considering the F4 Phantom. They were considering the Mirage F1. They were considering the Swedish Saab 37 Viggen, which was very advanced for this time. And, kind of opposite to that, they considered this little plane here, the Northrop F-5 Tiger. Now, the Tiger, at least the E variant, single seat, and F variant, twin seat, was a second generation. The original A's, B's, C's, and D's were designed in the 1950s to be lightweight, affordable, easy to operate, dependable, but still quality aircraft. While the U.S. Air Force and Navy were not interested, the U.S. Army liked it, but they couldn't operate fixed-wing aircraft. So instead, foreign customers like, say, Vietnam and later Singapore would operate this to actually very good success. But the original plane was a little small, a little limited. So in 1970, Northrop proposed the Tiger II version with more powerful engines, a reworked wing leading edge, more fuel. It was faster, more maneuverable, better range, and of course compatible with modern ordnance. And this would actually win the International Fighter Competition, the IFC, which the U.S. kind of hosted to try to help select a fighter for potential allies. And the first Tiger E would fly in 72, and the first F variant in 74. And Switzerland was interested. In fact, they acquired 2 for testing, much as they had done with the Hunter years earlier. And they really liked what they found. The money was right, the budget was right. So in 1976, they contracted to have 72 built. 66 of these would be single-seaters, F-5Es, and the first 13 would be built in the USA by Northrop, followed by the next 53 assembled in Emmen by the Federal Aircraft Factory. They would also need 6 two-seaters. Got one over here. I actually picked this one for a very specific reason, even though it's not Swiss. And all 6 of these would be assembled in the USA and shipped over. The first squadron was able to start training up on the new F-5E in 1978. By October of 79, they were joined by a second. And by 81, there were 3 active squadrons operating these. Also, the Patrel Swiss team started to use them some in conjunction with their Hunters. And things were going really well, so much so that a second order was placed, this time for 32 single-seat and 6 more two-seat. Now, of the 32 single-seat, only 1 was built in the U.S. The rest were assembled from kits by FAF. I don't know about the 6 additional twin seats. One might imagine they were still assembled in the U.S. just for logistics reasons, but who knows. Regardless, the order would continue, and the last ones were delivered in March of 85, and this is when the Tiger fleet was at its highest strength in Switzerland, with 98 single-seat and 12 two-seaters. A total of 5 squadrons were trained up on these, 3 full-time active and 2 reserve, plus again the Patrel Swiss team was using some. And they really liked it. It was about the same size, even a little smaller than the Mirage. It just over 48 feet long. Its wingspan was between 27 and 28 feet, depending if we had missiles on the rails, so about the same. The small dimensions were well suited for the caverns. It had 2 20mm cannon, M39s, and it had a total of, let's see, 7, 8, 9. It had a number of hard points here. Let me think here. 7 hard points. And it could carry about 7,000 pounds. So not quite as much as the Mirage. It also wasn't quite as fast. It could achieve Mach 1.6. And it had a maximum altitude of around 52,000 feet. So a little less flashy than the Mirage. But it had 2 very good, reliable engines. In fact, it could operate up to 40,000 feet with 1 engine not even working. It had very good maneuverability and acceleration, meaning it was able to operate from quite short airfields and kind of zoom through the mountain passes and valleys of Switzerland. And initially, they just ordered the air defense version. It was usually armed up with 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders, but it could carry up to 4. But of course, the Tiger F-5 did have a ground attack ability that could be added later, and that it finally allowed all the hunters to be retired out of the air defense role and dedicated to ground, which is why they were able to do the Hunter 80 program. So the Mirage squadrons, there were 2 of them, plus the reconnaissance, were still the best they had. But the Tigers were dependable and were able to give secondary support, and were just, generally speaking, really well liked. And while some were originally flown by active career pilots, they found that they were pretty easy to train reservists, who were usually commercial pilots, to fly on. And yeah, what else to say about it? It was kind of the opposite of the Mirage situation. There wasn't a scandal. It did well, and it came in on time and on budget, and proved to be a very economical, practical, sturdy choice. In fact, the Swiss variant had very few changes from what Northrop was delivering to other customers. It was a strong, durable little airframe intended for long life, which is something the Swiss Air Force always cared about. So yeah, by the early 90s, these were still in widespread active service. So this is another Hobby Master, but this is of a U.S. Navy version of the F-5F, the 2-seat, and I picked it for a couple of reasons. As I said, in 1994, they had to kind of prematurely retire the Hunter fleet because of stress fractures on the wings, meaning that they didn't really have a close air support craft. Now, it would not be long before they decided they really didn't need one, but there was some effort to fit some of the F-5Es and F-5Fs in Switzerland with the ability to work with the AIM-65 Maverick, as well as iron bombs and rocket pods, so it could fill the role if needed. And therefore the Mirage could be the air defense fighter. Now this is during a time of downsizing in the mid and late 90s. Several air bases were closed. They didn't really want to spend more money moving forward. And as they downsized the fleet, in 2006, Switzerland actually sold 36 low mileage, as I like to say, Tigers to the USA to be used by the Navy as aggressor aircraft. These were a mix of E's and F's, and that's why I picked this one. I thought it was kind of funny that this is kind of one of the aircraft that replaced the F-21, as the U.S. called the Kafir. And so they were taken into U.S. government service custody and updated to be F-5Ns, and are used as aggressors and what have you for training. And this let the Swiss kind of scale back their Tiger fleet. And actually, between 2011 and 2013, there was very serious talk. In fact, it was almost a done deal to replace these with the new Swedish Saab 39 Gripen. And they almost had the deal closed so they could go ahead and retire the rest of their F-5s. But by public referendum, direct democracy, this was voted down. So yet again, even after Switzerland had kind of teased Saab by looking at the 35, the 37, now the 39, yeah, it didn't happen. So the F-5s had to continue in the air defense role, as well as whatever they might need for close air support ground attack. Now the Patriot Swiss team would retire theirs. They would announce it in 2018, retiring theirs in 2019. But this would still leave roughly 18 single-seat E's active and 4 twin-seat F's in active service, plus a few more stuck back in reserve, just in case, because nothing else is on the horizon. Again, these are still primarily used with aim-eyed sidewinders, but some of them were worked so they could use some ground ordnance like the Maverick. Because by this point, the Mirage fleet is retired, the Hunters are retired, so that kind of does leave the burden on the F-5 Tigers. Well, except for, of course, our last aircraft here. The FA-18 Hornet. At the beginning, under McDonnell Douglas, but by the time in service was the Swiss Air Force under the Boeing name. So, okay, going back here. In the 1980s, they realize that they really probably need a multi-role fighter. The Cold War is still going on. They need something more modern. The Tiger V's doing great. Still don't have enough Mirages. And they realize the Hunters won't last forever. So multi-role, air-to-air, air-to-surface, reconnaissance, do it all. So they start looking around 1986, 87. And they check out the latest offerings from Dassault, which was the Mirage 2000. They also look at what Saab's up to, considering it's not even out yet and won't be for some time, but would have ultimately resulted in the Gripen. And they kind of decide to have a fly-off in May of 1988 between the General Dynamics F-16 fighting Falcon and the McDonnell Douglas FA-18 Hornet, which was just entering into service. It had gone into U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Navy service in 84, and the C variant, single seat, and the D variant, twin seat, were just coming out at this time. So there was a brand new variant, and in October of that year, the government selected the Hornet. But it wasn't without controversy. Actually, in 1990, the competition was again reopened to consider the latest version of the Mirage 2005, 2000-5. And because it looked like the process was going to take some time, they also would purchase about 20 low-hour Hawker Hunter, well, this time it's not Hawker, but you know what I mean, Hunters anyway, sorry. I have been doing this for a while. Hawks, there we go. Hawk, two-seat trainers from Britain, specifically the T-66 variant. Very well-respected little jet trainer. Even has light attack abilities because of its origins. So they would pick up 20 of these in 1990. Just so they had some more modern jet trainers, because they only had 12 Tiger 5s, only 2 Mirage 3Bs, which are aging out. So the competition's kind of open again, but again in June of 1991, they reaffirmed the choice of the Hornet. And in 93, it's put up for kind of a public vote. It passes, so the purchase goes ahead. They start to gear up. Now, it does seem unusual that Switzerland, a landlocked country without a carrier, and with a navy that only exists on a few lakes, why would they would pick an aircraft like this that was designed specifically for the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps? But it actually does make a lot of sense. It really, really does. This started off as the YF-17, the competitor to the F-16, which was a project between McDonnell Douglas and Northrop. Northrop and McDonnell Douglas at this period were kind of frenemies, and on and off. But anyway, it was changed, adapted into a carrier aircraft. And what they liked about it was its swing roll capability, fighter or attack. Twin engines, always good for carrier operations. Relatively low cost. It wasn't an exceedingly new aircraft, but it got the job done and did it very well. It did multiple jobs at once, so it was economical. What it was criticized for in the U.S. Navy was a relatively light payload, at least compared to some other aircraft like the A-6, but still it carried 13,000 pounds of ordnance. It was also criticized for its relatively low top speed and its relatively short range speaking. But these didn't really matter to the Swiss. It doesn't matter to what their needs were. Its assets really appealed to them. Its maximum speed of Mach 1.8, that's fine. It's faster than the Tigers. It's good enough. Maximum altitude of only about 51,000 feet. Again, it's fine for what they need. On the other hand, it had very good acceleration, and it was very maneuverable for its size. Speaking of, this would be the largest fighter aircraft that the Swiss would use. It's 56 feet long and has a wingspan of over 40 feet, so all in all bigger than anything before it. Now the wings could be folded up to give it a width of 32 feet, but still yet it's pretty big. Bigger than the Mirage, the Tiger, or the Hunter. This actually would require them to greatly modify their storage systems, their caves and caverns and transport to accommodate the Hornet here. And they pretty much bought off-the-shelf versions meant for the U.S. Navy. The fact that these were built to take carrier takeoffs and landings, catapult takeoffs and arrested landings meant they were very strong. Landing gear and all that, which Switzerland really liked. It also meant they could operate from short airfields, again, something Switzerland desperately needed, and something that really any land-based aircraft of that era didn't have. But they did have one change. They wanted the airframe to be updated with a titanium alloy to give these a guaranteed service life of at least 3 decades, 30 years. So that's the major difference. Also, the initial order would only be for the air-to-air, the air defense variant. So no ground attack capabilities. So the original order was for 26 single-seat C models and 8 twin-seat D models. Now this one over here I've picked is actually a U.S. Marine Corps version. So ignore the air-to-surface munitions. But it is a D. This is a true Swiss one, though, with the air-to-air loadout. And the idea was, well, we'll order these, and then we'll do another batch. And then we'll also upgrade them with air-to-surface munitions to take advantage of the multi-roll, the swing roll capabilities. But in 1995, there were some major budget cuts to the armed forces, all of them, including the Air Force. Several bases were shut down. And beginning on January 1st, 1996, the Swiss Air Force was truly an independent service from the Army. And this year is when the FA-18 would go ahead. Now, the first C and the first D, built to Swiss specs, were assembled in St. Louis, Missouri, in the USA, and the first of these flew January 20th, 1996. But the remaining 32 were to be assembled from kits by FAF and Endem in Switzerland. And while they were built with mostly American components, about a half a dozen Swiss subcontractors were used for certain parts and things. So this was a pretty close working relationship with everyone involved. Well, the first Swiss example that was built flew in October of 1996, and then the first Hornet was delivered to the Swiss Air Force in December. And it wouldn't be long before the first squadron started training with these in January of 1997. These would be Cs at this point. The first Ds would be delivered in 1998. And all of them would be done by December of 1999. Now, they ordered 34. They actually received 33 because one crashed during the workup. But this would allow squadrons to start transitioning over, and as you can tell by the dates, this is when they were able to retire the Mirage III SC7s. But they would keep the Tigers on for quite some time. And yeah, it was well received, well liked, even though it did require a lot more pilot training. In fact, the Hornets have only been allowed in the hands of career, professional, full-time military pilots. Reservists, nope, not so much. They were typically armed with 2 AIM-9X, so the newer Sidewinder, and usually 4 AIM-120s. Originally, it would be the B model. In more recent times, it's the AIM-120C, which is a medium range. This model here actually has 6 on because it's utilizing the centerline stations there on each side of the, I guess it really wouldn't be chin stations, but you know what I mean. So this has 6 AMRAAMs plus the 2 short range. No pods on it. It does still have the 20mm M61A1 cannon. And yeah, it's pretty much straight off the American schematic board, just with a reinforced frame, because these are expected to last at least up until 2030. So here's our U.S. Marine Corps FA-18D Hornet. These weren't purchased really to be used as trainers. Now, for that, we had either the remaining F-5Fs or, again, these Hawks over here. These are meant more for multi-role. The idea was that they would order more Hornets, again, presumably assembling them, and they would do a midlife upgrade, giving them ground attack capability, essentially Switzerland purchasing air-to-surface munitions of different types. And in the Marine Corps here, that's what the backseater does. He's a weapons officer. And this would allow them to retire the F-5, but several things happened. Today, the Swiss Air Force has very, very little, if anything, to do with air-to-surface, and so unlike years ago. That's just not their objective now. Part of it has to do with the scaling back of their forces and personnel. Many bases have been closed. Many fixed-wing aircraft of different types have been retired. And the personnel today is down to 1,600 full-time career officers, with another 20,000 reserves if war were ever to break out. So just, yeah, scaling back of responsibilities. And so they're focusing on air patrol, maintaining the sovereignty of Switzerland's airspace. Also reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, that's kind of a secondary role. Way in the back, just a tiny sliver, is their close air support, ground attack, ground projection capability. Therefore, they really didn't push forward with the A part of the FA-18. So, very few, if any, have ever been fitted out with bombs or rockets or air-to-surface munitions of any other type. Now, this is an air defense aircraft. Now, it has to be said, talking about the Ds, I said we had 8 on order. But they've had a, unfortunately, kind of high crash rate. And a lot of it has to do with just the mountainous terrain and everything else going on in Switzerland. The first one was lost in 1998, April. Unfortunately, 2 people were killed. The next one would be quite a long time later. It would not happen until October of 2013. But again, the 2 crew would lose their lives. And the most recent crash of a Swiss F-18D was in October of 2015. So since 2016, they've operated 5 Ds. They've also lost 1 C, so 25. So the fleet is down to 30 aircraft with no plans to purchase more. And as I mentioned with the F-5 Tiger, efforts to get something else like the Gripen have not gone forward, meaning they're having to rely on their existing F-5s and their 30-some-odd Hornets. The existing Hornets are used by 3 squadrons, and 1 is used as a solo demonstration team. And I believe it's a C. I don't think it's a D variant. So one of the C's is peeled off for air displays. For example, in 2014, there was a big air show in Switzerland to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Swiss Air Corps, Luftwaffe, Air Service, Air Force. But for right now, it's actually a very good thing they purchased their Hornets with those extended hour airframes. They have received some upgrades. Again, I mentioned the AIM 120C vis-a-vis the original B. And they have received some computer and avionics updates. But they haven't been produced since the late 90s, meaning all of them are over 2 decades old. So eventually something will have to be done. But as of now, it looks like this will be the frontline fighter in Switzerland till at least 2035. And potentially beyond. We'll just have to wait and see. And see if they end up ever committing to the air-to-ground ability or not, as originally had been planned. And there you have it, folks. The fixed-wing primary fighter, fighter interceptors, fighter bombers, if you will, of the Swiss Luftwaffe. Let's close with some final thoughts. And there we have it. And I appreciate you hanging out with me. Again, if you came over from the main Mishaco channel, I appreciate you coming over to my personal channel. And, yeah, just kind of interesting, the history of the Swiss Air Force. It's always been small and at times underfunded, yet also very proud and has done a lot with sometimes very little throughout its 107-year history now. Corgi does make a Mark 58, but I don't have one. But since many of them were ex-RAF Mark 9s anyway, it'll do. If a Swiss one comes around one day, I'll pick it up, but not likely. Falcon is long out of business, so I'm just happy to have this one. It'll do. It's French. But these two are in true Swiss guise, right down to the ordnance and the paint job. So that's nice, at least. Well, if you have any questions or comments, please do share them below. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe, and let me know which one is your favorite. What do you think? This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.